Just look at these career stats for Brandon Ingram. He has been an incredible wing scorer for years, a former All-Star, basically the centerpiece of the Anthony Davis trade that won the Lakers the 2020 title, and he's basically just now entering his prime, yet nobody in the NBA wants him. As of right now, we all know that he's on the New Orleans Pelicans, but whether or not that's actually going to be the case when the NBA season starts is very much up in the air. Now, first we have to tackle why exactly nobody wants Brandon Ingram. It is clear that he is a talented player. It's clear that he is an asset to not only the Pelicans, but to other teams around the league as well. So why does nobody want him? Well, first and foremost, he needs to get paid. He's on the last year of his contract where he's getting paid a little bit over $30 million, and he is seeking a much bigger contract than that. In his view, in his estimation, he's worth over $50 million. Whatever the max would be for Brandon Ingram, that is what he is looking for. It's what he's been looking for from New Orleans in contract extension talks, and that is the expectation that he has set if he is sent to another team and they would like to retain him. He is an unrestricted free agent a year from now, and he can leave if he wants to, which makes it difficult for these other teams to trade for him if they don't think that they're going to be willing to pay him that number. The other reason why nobody really wants him at the moment is part of the reason why New Orleans isn't super excited about bringing him back on a massive contract. He's a little bit of a weird fit. Despite his career accolades, despite his scoring throughout his career, he's a little bit in that DeMar DeRozan kind of category where DeMar has been really good for a long time, but his market has always been a little bit lower than you would expect it would be compared to his stats and his career accolades. Because similar to DeRozan, Ingram is very good and he can score the ball really well. He's a really good offensive player, but in order to maximize the potential Brandon Ingram, he has to have the ball a lot. He has to be a primary guy. And if Brandon Ingram is one of your primary offensive weapons, you're probably not going to be winning a whole lot of basketball games. So he finds himself in this weird category of player where he's not an all-NBA caliber guy. He's not one of the best 8 scorers in the entire league, but he's also not a spot up and shoot, let me just shoot a ton of threes, be a role player guy. And he's not one of these bench 6-man players. He's not Jordan Clarkson. He's not one of these guys that's going to come off the bench and score a ton. He's never been that in his career. So what exactly is he? Not to mention the fact you have to pay him $50+ million. And this is especially an issue for a Pelicans team that already has Zion, who's going to need the ball a ton. They traded for DeJounte Murray. They have CJ McCollum. And from an offensive perspective, they already have plenty of guys that not only need the ball, but thrive with the ball and are arguably better than Brandon Ingram. Now, I don't want to make it seem like Brandon Ingram is bad. He is still a very good player, still an asset. Just all these factors have come together to the point where it doesn't really seem like he has a home. And that is especially interesting for a Pelicans team that could kind of use a Brandon Ingram trade right about now. They've traded away a bunch of pieces, they shifted around their roster, and they've settled on a group of CJ McCollum, DeJounte Murray, Zion, Trey Murphy, Herb Jones. The problem with those 5 players, those are the 5 best guys in the team, is none of them are a big man. None of them play the 5. And right now, the depth chart of the 5 for New Orleans is basically non-existent. So you would think the easy solution here is you trade Brandon Ingram to a team that's going to trade you back a true 5. That's going to complete your starting lineup and everybody's happy. But clearly, New Orleans has not found that trade yet. And when you go through and you try and find what the Brandon Ingram trade would be, the team that would want him, the team that would be willing to give stuff up for him, and the team that would be willing to pay him a new contract beyond this season, it gets very difficult to find that team. For example, you could look at a team like Toronto that is a little bit in the middle of not quite tanking, not quite a guaranteed playoff team by any means. Maybe they could see a scenario in which, similar to how they traded away OG Anunoby, they traded away Pascal Siakam, maybe they'll trade away Bruce Brown and Jakob Poeltl and get back a player in Brandon Ingram that is still entering his prime that could be an asset for them moving forward. And they're clearly willing to pay guys. They paid Emmanuel Quickley, they paid Scotty Barnes. Why not also bring in someone like Brandon Ingram and pay him? And worst case, you can just trade him down the line if it's not a good fit. And for New Orleans, that gives them the 5 men that they need in Poeltl and helps their wing rotation as well with someone like Bruce Brown. On the other hand, the team that arguably has more of a surplus at the 5 than any team in the league would be the Portland Trailblazers. They have Donovan Clingan, who they just drafted. They have DeAndre Ayton, who they traded for a year ago. They have Robert Williams, who they traded for a year ago. So what if Portland called them and said, hey, we'll take a gamble on Robert Williams staying healthy. We'll also take Jeremy Grant's giant contract off your books, and you guys can have Brandon Ingram. And again, that solidifies the lineup for the Pelicans. And Portland is kind of in that middle ground as well that Toronto's been in, where they're able to add guys like Denny Avdija during the offseason, but they're also clearly trying to lose some games next year. And quite frankly, those are the only two teams that I've found have a realistic path to adding Brandon Ingram. Some of the other options would be a team like Utah trading Walker Kessler and Jordan Clarkson in exchange for Ingram, but they have to resolve their own situation with Lauri Markkanen, so that seems unlikely. And the funny thing about this entire thing is I actually think there's a lot of teams around the league that if Brandon Ingram was signed to a contract and this was next year, would trade for him, and or teams that would be willing to trade for Brandon Ingram, and like if he would just go away for a year and then show up to the team next year, they'd be willing to trade for him. Because the thing that complicates all of this is this draft class and the following are very, very good. It's not like the 2024 class where there's no true prize. The top 5 of each of these draft classes coming up are very good. And there are a lot of teams around the league, especially in the Eastern Conference, that don't want to add someone like Brandon Ingram because they don't want to add any more wins to potentially get them out of better lottery odds. That's just the reality of the NBA at the moment. So teams like the Nets, Washington, Detroit, pick any of these truly bad teams in the Eastern Conference. A year from now, they probably would love to add a scorer of Brandon Ingram's caliber, but they're not going to do it right now because they don't want to add any more wins. And obviously, they're not going to trade for Brandon Ingram and then tell him, hey, just sit on the sideline for a year. That's not a realistic outcome, which is why nobody wants Brandon Ingram. There are so many factors that have come together in a perfect way or an imperfect way if you're Brandon Ingram to create this situation where there is basically zero market for a player that is entering their prime, that is an all-star caliber guy, that is a really good scorer, should be an asset to plenty of teams, including New Orleans. And they've made it clear that Brandon Ingram is not a priority for them long-term. They've made it clear by the way that they have shifted around their roster that they are willing to trade him for a 5, for an answer at that spot. And it feels like we're all just waiting for a team to step up and be the team that trades for Brandon Ingram. But what if that doesn't happen? What if this is a giant miscalculation on the part of the New Orleans Pelicans, thinking that they were either going to be able to get an extension done with Brandon Ingram or that they were going to be able to find a team to trade for him? And then they go into the year and he's just on the team and they don't have an option at the 5. This is, in theory, from a talent perspective, one of the better teams in the Western Conference, if healthy, which we're going to say all the time for New Orleans. Zion is that good. The other supporting cast players are that good. And they are a Brandon Ingram solution away from maybe looking at a top 5 or a top 4 seed in a very crowded Western Conference this upcoming season. And it is just strange that a team that is that talented, that has that high of expectations for this coming season, has this one piece on their roster that they just can't find a solution to. And I am incredibly interested to see if this extends on into the season, if they can get an extension done with him or not, because if they go into the year and they go to the deadline and they don't trade Brandon Ingram, they're looking at losing him for absolutely nothing in a year when teams are going to have cap space, when those teams in the Eastern Conference that I mentioned, Brooklyn, Washington, Detroit, are going to have the option to bring in someone like Brandon Ingram and have the cap space to do so. The Pelicans have put themselves in a situation where this is a very, very dangerous thing that they're dealing with, where they could lose an asset in Brandon Ingram for nothing. They could not have a starting 5 on the roster this year. They could have an unhappy Brandon Ingram on the roster this year, all because they just assumed incorrectly to this point that there were going to be teams that actually wanted Brandon Ingram.